Hello everyone and welcome to our module on the skin. The skin is the largest organ in the body. This is sometimes a question on Jeopardy! It's a barrier against infection. We don't think of it this way very often, but it's one component of our immune defense against bacteria and other infectious agents. It also prevents water loss. One of the major problems if you have severe skin damage like a burn is that it can be hard for the body to hold on to water. And the skin is made up of three layers. The outer layer is called the epidermis. This contains cells called keratinocytes, which are squamous epithelial cells. The next deepest layer is called the dermis. This contains connective tissue and blood and lymph vessels. And then beneath that there is the subcutaneous fat, which is also sometimes called the hypodermis or the subcutis. Here's a picture of the dermis and the epidermis, and the epidermis is divided into 5 layers. So let's go through those now. So at the bottom of this picture is the dermis, that's shown here. It's got connective tissue and blood vessels. The layer of the epidermis that sits right on top of the dermis is called the stratum basale, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but this layer contains basal cells, which are stem cells that can regenerate the skin. The next most outer layer is called the stratum spinosum. It gets its name because you can see little spines along the cell borders here. Above that is the stratum granulosum. This is this layer here with granular cells. Above that is the stratum lucidum, and then on the top you have the stratum corneum. And then here's another picture in cartoon form just to make this very clear. The stratum basale, followed by the spinosum, the granulosum, the lucidum, and then the corneum is on top. So now let's go through these epidermal layers one at a time. So as I mentioned before, the stratum basalis is the basal layer of the epidermis. It sits on top of the dermis, and it contains stem cells that are capable of regenerating keratinocytes in the epidermis. Above the stratum basalis is the stratum spinosum, and this layer has cells with spines. And what forms those spines are desmosomes. These are connections between keratinocytes. And as we'll see in other videos, in some disorders, desmosomes are disrupted, and those disorders tend to affect the stratum spinosum significantly. Above the spinosum is the stratum granulosum. These cells contain granules. That's why they're dark in this picture here. The granules are a substance called keratohyalin, and they are used by squamous epithelial cells in the epidermis to form keratin filaments. Above the granulosum is the stratum lucidum. This layer gets its name because it's clear and it contains dead skin cells. It's a thin layer in the epidermis. And then the outer layer is the stratum corneum. And what you need to know about this layer is that the cells in this layer are anucleated. They've lost their nucleus. And we'll talk about later how in some pathological processes you see nucleated cells in the stratum corneum. That is abnormal. And the reason the cells are anucleated is because they're filled with keratin filaments. So keratin is a tough structural protein. It assembles into filaments, and this